For 5 years, I sent $200 on the 5th of every month through a crack in a warped door, like I was tucking a secret into the folds of the building. I thought I was honoring a promise. I thought I was keeping my end of a bargain I'd made with a man who was supposed to be gone forever. I didn't know then that the thing I believed most, my grief, my loyalty, my quiet sacrifice, would be the very thing they used against me. It was the 5th of the month again. The stairway smelled like old smoke and lemon cleaner. My breath fogged in front of my face as I climbed, Malik's backpack bumping against my leg. The envelope was already folded in my palm, the $200 I had scraped together from overtime, clipped coupons, skipped coffees. I slid it through the mail slot and waited for the soft thud that meant it had landed on the threshold. Viola's door was shut. The hallway light hummed. Downstairs, someone was arguing on a phone in a language I didn't know. I stayed on the landing long enough to pretend I was just catching my breath. I listened for any sign that the door might open, heard nothing, and let myself think I'd done the right thing. Then I turned and went home. That ritual, walk up 5 flights, slip the envelope, pretend nothing is wrong, became how I measured time. The months folded into years the way the calendar pages did. Neat, predictable, like a promise well kept. $200 a month doesn't sound like much until you subtract food, rent, bus fares, school supplies. $200 a month is the difference between an extra shift or staying home with a feverish child. $200 a month is what I gave to keep a memory tidy. If this is resonating with you and you want to follow what happened next, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll tell you everything I remember. Marcus was supposed to be the center of our universe. He was loud and loving in the ways that seep into a house, the smell of cinnamon when he cooked, the way he messed up the couch cushions and left tiny fingerprints on the kettle. He left 3 years before the promise started, then came back like a ghost, bruised, apologetic, in a hurry to fix things that weren't broken. When he died, the funeral was a blur of flowers and the low hum of people saying the same comforting things. The state took care of a lot of the details that day. Mr. Tate organised the burial and handled the life insurance forms like someone who'd been doing it a long time. After the funeral, Viola and Elijah sat across from me at their small kitchen table and asked, quietly, for the debt to be paid. They weren't cruel about it. They didn't have to be. There was a measured urgency in Viola's voice, like she was reading from her own rules about dignity and reputation. Marcus had left them something in debt, houses, repairs, unpaid tabs. The number they told me added up to $12,000. I thought it was steep. I thought it was too steep. But I remembered Marcus promising me before he left that he would set everything right. When he didn't, when he was gone and couldn't answer for himself, the only person who had anything to say was me. I made the choice to pay. Maybe I wanted to believe I could be the bridge between what was and what should be. Maybe I wanted to keep Malik from seeing the ugly edges of our family split apart. Maybe, in my grief, I clung to the idea of loyalty like a lifeline. They suggested installments. $200 a month sounded manageable. It would be taken from the same envelope I fed into the slot at the top of the stairs. At first, there were small signs. The way Viola would fold a letter and tuck it into her apron, the polite nods she gave when I mentioned Malik's school projects. There were moments when Elijah handed me a container of soup because he saw I'd worked a late shift. Those were the crumbs that convinced me my decision was right. The in-laws were not monsters. They were reserved. They were practical. They needed help. I obliged. I kept receipts I didn't need. I logged the payments in a notebook I carried in the inner pocket of my coat. The numbers lined up on paper, $2,400 a year, $12,000 after 5. I would look at them and feel the weight of both the math and what lay behind it. I paid in cash because Viola asked for cash. Mr. Tate had recommended it at the meeting in his soft, professional voice. He said it would be simpler. Simpler, I learned, could mean less traceable. There's a way grief multiplies permission. Once you accept one thing as unchangeable, other things slide into place. I told myself that sacrifice was noble. I told myself that a mother's duty is to protect, even when it hurts. I told myself that if I could smooth the lives of Marcus's parents, I was honouring his memory. Those reasons felt good enough to quiet the irritation I sometimes carried like a pebble in my shoe. Miss Hattie had lived across the hall forever. She'd watched us move in when Malik was still tiny, and she'd watched him grow taller than her porch railing. She knew the building in the way some people know the lines on their palm, every leak, every crooked tile. It was Miss Hattie who leaned over her balcony one afternoon and said, quieter than anyone had the right to, "You should watch the camera." At first I laughed it off. Cameras. I thought about the funeral home, about paperwork, about every official ritual we had complied with. I had placed my trust in the adults who told me what to do. But Miss Hattie's eyes saw a thing that other people's didn't. She saw pattern. "You pay every month, right?" she asked. And when I said yes, she said, "I see people come and go at odd hours. Sometimes a man with a limp walks in, sometimes nobody knocks." She spoke like someone who had been folding this information into her head for a long time. "If I were you, honey, I'd ask somebody to pull the camera, just for your peace." It was the gentlest nudge and the sharpest crack in all my certainty. Peace, I thought. Was I owed peace after all this? The thought felt almost decadent. I'd been so careful to keep up appearances. I'd waved away the small doubts that sat like saucers on my chest. But Miss Hattie's words made the doubt louder. Dante was the kind of cousin who could make a computer do things it wasn't supposed to do. He had a steady way of speaking that made complicated ideas feel like maps you could read if you walked with him. When I told him what Miss Hattie had said, he didn't roll his eyes. He asked exactly where the camera was, and the next morning he had a USB with a few days' worth of footage. We sat at my kitchen table with the light off and the laptop screen bright. Malik was at school. My hands were clammy. I kept wanting to make tea and couldn't. Dante clicked through clips like a hypnotist, advancing frame by frame until the grainy night scene seemed to move like a slow-motion film. The hallway camera was fixed near the ceiling. The image flickered. Nighttime compresses things. Shadows stretch. Colours wash out. I had to remind myself that what I was seeing was not the truth itself, but how the truth looked through cheap plastic and low light. The first clip was unremarkable. Someone passing by the mailboxes, a hood up, shoulders hunched. The second clip made my stomach drop in the way it does when you fall asleep, and then remember the alarm. A figure came shuffling down the hallway at 10:30 at night. He was limping. He moved in the exact familiar rhythm Marcus used to when his ankle would give him trouble after a bad day at work. My hands went numb. Dante kept the image paused while I stared at the loop. One step, the favouring of one leg, the subtle way the shoulders twisted. It was the kind of detail only a person who has spent day after day beside someone would know. "You see that?" Dante said softly. "Same gait." I wanted to argue. My brain offered up reasons like spare coins to fend off panic. The hallway shadows made everyone strange. The camera could be faulty. People make similar movements. But even as I supplied those rational bars, the quiet, relentless truth pushed through. This was a man who walked the Mississippi of our life in a way I knew by memory. We watched clip after clip. Each time the same figure arrived late, sometimes around 2 in the morning, sometimes a little earlier, always limping, always pausing at the same spot near Viola's door, never knocking. Once or twice the silhouette slipped inside without fuss, the door closing softly behind. Dante slowed the footage until the frames were a flipbook. I could see the fold of a jacket, the flash of a watch, sometimes a hood, sometimes a cap. The camera's timestamp blinked in the corner, straightforward and cruel. November 15th, 11:47 p.m. December 5th, 1:12 a.m. March 2nd, 2:04 a.m. There was a terrible rhythm to it, a cadence to the coming and going that mapped the payments I made. I checked my notebook and matched dates, cross-referencing tiny scrawls of numbers with the stale, night-lit faces on screen. Months where bills had been tight, I still saw the figure entering the door. The pattern didn't make sense with what Viola had told me about needing help with bills. It suggested something else, but I wasn't ready to name it. I printed frames and taped them to the wall over the stove, like a detective showing their evidence. The photographs were small, grainy, ghost-like. They were also, unmistakably, proof that someone was lying about the way things were supposed to be. Neighbours leaned into the story in the way buildings do, carrying gossip through vents and over laundry lines. Mrs. Jenkins, from the second floor, said she had seen a man at odd hours loading boxes into a van once, and there had been pizza boxes in the trash by Viola's door more times than she could count. Miss Hattie said she'd heard muffled voices from inside the apartment late at night on more than one occasion, and those voices weren't always Viola's. Each little piece threaded into the other, making fabric where there had been only single threads. I started to look at the world like a ledger. Where money goes, curiosity follows. I asked Viola once, very politely, and with my voice steady, why a man might be in their apartment so late, and whether Marcus had ever come back to town. She said Marcus was buried, and that she wished people would stop bringing up things that hurt. Her hands were folded, like she kept something fragile inside, and she asked me to respect their grief. Elijah, when I tried to speak to him, looked at the floor and said nothing. Silence, I discovered, could be a shield as effective as any argument. The more I looked, the more my small sacrifices began to feel like holes. The months I'd felt proud of myself for tucking away kindness into an envelope now looked like parts of a machine I hadn't known I was fueling. My mind raced with practicalities. Where did the money go after it left my hand? Who had the keys? How many people knew about the life insurance payout? Who else benefited while Malik and I stayed small and careful? There's a particular kind of quiet that follows recognition. It isn't loud or dramatic. It's the hush that sits after a siren passes. For me, it was a silence full of small, accusing images, the by-now familiar limping shadow, envelopes left in a slot, Malik's little shoes lined up by the door. I began to catalogue what I could prove and what I could only remember. The camera frames gave me a place to stand. Memories without evidence swirl like ash. Evidence holds shape. Dante did more than pull camera files. He started tracing the edges, checking social media handles for people who had shown up in the background of family photos, cross-referencing names that popped up in comments, looking at small clues like brands of watch or shirt that showed up repeatedly on the grainy clips. He was careful to tell me that what he could find online was not proof, it was a direction. He said, "We follow the paper trail and the pixels. Neither one lies forever." He was half joking, but I liked that he'd said it. Between the camera footage and neighbours' accounts, a theory grew, not loud and triumphant, but insistent the way a weed insists through a crack in the pavement. Someone was using Viola and Elijah's apartment after hours. Someone moved when dark hid them. Someone who walked like Marcus. When I first allowed myself to consider the possibility that Marcus might be alive, it felt like stepping through a thin veil into a colder room. My brain stacked reasons like firewood to keep my panic burning at a manageable level. People can be falsely identified in bad video. Grief makes people hungry for answers. Maybe the man was a friend, maybe a nephew, maybe someone else from Marcus's old life. I told myself these things, but the pauses between each thought grew longer, like someone holding a conversation and leaving their response hanging. I went back through my notebook and the bank records I had the courage to pull together. There were no surprise deposits into Viola's account that matched the size of what I'd given, no clear paper trail that explained who was benefiting. Mr. Tate's name showed up in a few notes I had saved, small bureaucratic things about funeral costs and insurance claims. I called him once and left a message. He returned it with the careful tone of a man who knows the procedures. Files moved, payments made, beneficiaries confirmed. His reassurance was professional, but it hadn't quieted the hollow in my chest. At night, after Malik slept, after the house settled and my eyelids finally forgot to be vigilant, I would lie awake and replay the clips. The footage was low-res enough that sometimes it felt like looking at someone through fogged glass, intimate and yet somehow not entirely theirs. I noticed small things. How the man leaned into the stair where the banister had a nick, because Marcus had once bumped it with his knee. How he paused the way Marcus would when he tried to remember a line from a song. These were cruel little proofs that had nothing to do with the legal system and everything to do with memory. Dante kept bringing me small, careful updates. He would slide his laptop across the table and say, "See, this isn't a one-off," pointing out the recurring timestamps and what looked like the same jacket in different seasons. He was practical and almost clinical about it, which helped. He talked about timestamps and frame rates and how to compile a chain of evidence that would mean something to a lawyer or a cop. When he mentioned lawyers, my throat tightened. I had imagined calling someone like Mr. Tate had suggested, an adult with a badge of authority, and being told it was a misunderstanding. What I was starting to suspect felt stranger and more dangerous. Part of me wanted to shout, to demand answers right that second, to march up the 5 flights and demand Viola open her door and tell me the truth. Instead, I sat with the footage and traced the man's steps with my finger on the frozen screen. It was a strange new practice, to be both witness and investigator, to hold grief and suspicion in the same hands. Malik deserved better than my frozen resolve. He deserved a mother who could move forward without carrying a debt that had nothing to do with him. The first seeds of fear were practical, not cinematic. I worried about retribution, if anyone involved recognized me poking around. I worried about Malik hearing things he wasn't meant to. I worried about being written off as a bitter widow, someone whose grief made her see conspiracies in ordinary life. The uglier fear, the one I didn't say out loud, was the stifled private anger that boiled when I imagined those $200 being spent on things that had nothing to do with bills. We compiled what we had into a small folder, printed frames from the camera, notes from neighbours, my ledger, and a list of dates that matched payments to the pattern of visits. Dante said we needed more, something that put a face to the silhouette in a way that counted in a courtroom. He spoke of tracking other evidence, of watching patterns, of looking for places where a live voice might slip up. It was Miss Hattie who handed me the next nudge without realising the shape she was giving to my decision. She stopped me in the hall one afternoon with a shoebox in her arms and said, "You should go out to Marcus's gravesite. I always found people who think about someone find answers at their bones. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see the neat stones and smell lilies and have grief rub up against suspicion. But there is an odd logic to visiting a grave when you are doubting whether what you were told at the funeral was true. You go to the place where a thing is supposed to be to confirm whether it is still there." I booked the trip on a Wednesday and took the Saturday bus to Indiana. I told Malik we were going to visit a park and lied easily. The bus smelled of coffee, and the man beside me read a paper with a headline about a mayor. I swallowed the lie without flinching. The cemetery was smaller than I expected. The air was thin and cold, the ground crisp underfoot. The niche where Marcus's ashes had been interred, where Viola had told me she'd placed sacrifice and memory, was neat and solemn. I stood there, hands shoved into my coat pockets like a person who could only steady themselves from the outside. The urn was a small, tasteful thing. The person who opened the niche did so with care. He wore gloves. I watched him lift the lid and felt my heart beat in my throat. Inside, there were stones. Not ashes. Not the fine grey hush of what I had been promised. Stones, dull and unremarkable, like the kind you find in a riverbank. The sight of them stopped me the way wind stops a song mid-verse. For a long time I could do nothing but breathe and watch the man set the lid back on with polite efficiency. In that instant, the ledger of my life, my notebook with its careful entries, my sleepless nights, fell heavier than any one person could carry. The stones didn't explain who had been slipping in at night, but they answered a different question. Someone had been lying about whether Marcus was gone. Someone had manufactured evidence of death that might never have held up under a more sceptical eye. I felt outrage rise, then a strange, cold clarity. The promise I'd made, to honour Marcus's debts, to keep a family whole, suddenly had a cost that was no longer abstract. I recorded the niche on my phone and sent the clip to Dante with the subject line, "You need to see this." He called almost immediately. "This isn't just a bad precedent," he said. "It's fraud, but be careful. Evidence is what matters, not righteous rage." That night I sat with a new weight. The camera footage suggested someone walking like Marcus. The urn suggested no ashes. The two things together turned my suspicions into a path. Between them was the place where intention and action met, what I had paid and what I had been given in return. I started to make plans I had never imagined I would have to make. I wrote down names and dates. I thought about who could help me compile evidence that mattered. I thought about a lawyer, about contacting the police. Each option felt like stepping further away from who I had been, a mother trying to keep things simple. Each option also felt like the only route toward the kind of truth that could let me breathe again. There was one more picture forming at the edge of everything I was doing. If Marcus was alive, if the death had been staged, then who else knew? Was it just Viola and Elijah? Was it Mr. Tate? Was it people like Darius? People who had always been on the periphery of Marcus's life? The questions multiplied and refused to be answered in my head. They demanded action. Dante put it gently. We keep following the trail, Kesha. Camera, neighbours, records. We don't jump. We document. His voice steadied me. I owed Malik a version of me that did not unravel at the sight of a grainy clip. I owed him a life not propped up on secrets and shame. So we kept watching. We pulled more footage. We printed more frames. We called a few more neighbours and got a nod here, a comment there, someone mentioning a van, someone else mentioning a late-night visit. Each detail was small, like a pebble thrown into a pond. The ripples met in the middle and grew into something I could no longer ignore. On a rainy Tuesday, Dante sat across from me at my kitchen table with a manila envelope full of printed clips and a folder with bank statements. He said, "If you want to take this further, we need to be methodical. We need a lawyer who will take us seriously." There was a look in his eyes I hadn't seen before, less cousin, more ally. My hands shook a little as I reached for the envelope. Malik's laughter from the next room felt like an accusation and a consolation all at once. I thought about my promise again, not the one I had made with my wallet, but the one I had made to my son the day he was born, to make sure he had a home, and food, and the dignity of not knowing the shame I carried in the background. I could keep paying and keeping quiet, and maybe the bills would get smaller, maybe the worry would go dull. Or I could try to take back what was mine: clarity, safety, the ability to sleep without counting footsteps. Dante tapped the printed frame where the silhouette's leg carried most of its weight on the left foot. "You recognize this walk, right?" he asked. I nodded. "I do." "Then we start there," he said. "We build the chain, camera to neighbour statement to bank records. We don't accuse. We present what we have. And if we can find witness or physical proof, if there's even a recording, then we take it to someone who can act." It felt like stepping over a line I hadn't known existed. My life until then had been mostly private, a series of quiet compromises. Now I was forming a paper trail with deliberate intent. I was turning grief into investigation. I was learning to use tools that were not designed for me, for women like me who had believed in promises and paid for them with labour and love. There was one last thing Dante said before he left that I couldn't shake. He looked at me, and his voice went soft, almost reverent. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. I had been doing everything alone for so long, I almost didn't know how not to. But hearing those words felt like someone opening a window. The plan at that point was as small as the phone screen, but as solid as the cold metal of the mailbox I'd leaned against 1,000 times. We would compile, document, and then we would decide what to do with the evidence. That's where the story pauses for now, not at the end, not yet at the righteous moment when I marched up the stairs and demanded the truth, but at the hinge where suspicion becomes action. I taped the printed frames to my wall, and at night I would run my finger along the grainy silhouette, as if I could smooth out the distortion and reveal the face beneath. I had kept my promise for years. I thought I was honouring memory. I thought I was protecting my son's future. I had not realised how those promises could be turned into a ledger that someone else would profit from. The truth sat like an ember ready to flare. The next steps were dangerous and necessary. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would be methodical. Mostly, I told myself one small, stubborn thing. I would not let Malik grow up in a house paid for by lies. The next morning, I filled out a list of questions I needed answers to. Who had keys to Viola's apartment? When did the man enter? Did the insurance company have documents that matched what I'd been told? Where, if anywhere, had Marcus's supposed effects gone? I folded the answers into the pocket of my coat, alongside the same notebook that had once tracked my rent and grocery runs. I put it there like armour. Outside, the building breathed the city's usual life. People went to work, kids chased each other down the sidewalk. The ordinary world moved with ordinary speed. Inside, the world I knew had shifted. My hand, which had once slipped an envelope into a slot in the dark, was now steady enough to pick up a phone and call a lawyer. My voice quavered on that first call, but it didn't break. I gave them the facts. I didn't let myself fill in the blanks with anger. I let the evidence do the talking. They told me to bring everything. They told me not to confront anyone. They told me to be careful. In their voice was the same professional calm I heard in Mr. Tate's earlier, softer reassurances. But there was one essential difference. Now I had a plan for a path forward that didn't depend on my endless solitary sacrifice. Now I had a way to turn the ritual I'd been performing into testimony. When I walked up those 5 flights that evening, envelope tucked into the inner pocket where it had lived for years, the ritual felt different. I slid my hand into the slot and felt paper, not weight. The motion felt like an old muscle memory trying on new habits. Malik's laugh floated up from his homework, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel guilty for hearing it. I felt like someone on the edge of a decision, like the moment before a tide turns. There are stories that end in a single revelation, and then an immediate fix. This wasn't one of those. The truth had multiple strokes, like something being painted in layers. The footage, the urn, the neighbours, each piece of evidence would take its place in a larger picture. Each piece also demanded someone to confirm and connect it. I slept poorly, but I slept with a plan. The next week would be full of emails and calls, of Dante clicking through more dusty archives, of checking and rechecking what I had already found. I was no longer just keeping a promise. I was leaning into the work of deciding what kind of life I wanted to build from the wreckage of a promise broken. And so I moved forward, not loudly, not with scenes of dramatic confrontation, but with a steady, slow-growing resolve. The world outside didn't notice. The building continued to smell of lemon cleaner and old smoke, but in my apartment there was a new smell: coffee, old paper, and the faint metallic scent of a truth I was learning to hold. The next days moved with a kind of fierce, purposeful momentum I hadn't felt in years. Once you light a match in a dark room, you notice every shadow. Dante widened what we had into something that could be shown, a chain that connected the camera frames to real names and real transactions. He would sit at my kitchen table with the laptop open and talk in that calm, map-making voice he always used, clicking through browser tabs the way someone might turn pages in a book. He found a scrap of a comment under a photo, an offhand reply that mentioned a warehouse near the industrial park. Someone in the replies used a nickname, Buzzard. It was Darius's handle in one of the local groups that shared odd jobs and car parts. Dante cross-referenced a photo where a hand wearing a particular watch showed up in the background of a street corner photo. It wasn't proof by itself, it was a direction. But the direction led to an address, an old building whose corrugated metal face had the look of a place people visited when they didn't want anyone to know they were there. When he told me, I felt something like vertigo. The image of Marcus on the grainy footage, the stones in the urn, the dates on my ledger, all of them aligned into a thin, ugly line pointing toward that warehouse. For the first time, the suspicion felt less like a private wound and more like a public problem with an address. We spoke to a lawyer next, the sort of woman who had a folder of cases and the look of someone who'd held tight to other people's truths before. I watched my own hand as I slid the printed frames across her desk, felt like I was passing along a small, dangerous thing. She listened. She asked for specifics. She asked about chain of custody, who had handled the footage, whether the timestamps had been preserved, whether the urn had been recorded before anyone touched it. She spoke in careful, plain terms that made legal things feel possible. We can use this. We need more connective tissue, but we can use it. She told me not to go anywhere near the warehouse or confront anyone. It felt almost ridiculous to be told that after everything I'd already done in private, but the instruction came with a reason: safety, admissibility, and the need to keep the moral high ground. If there was one thing I'd learned in the past months, it was that righteous rage is a dangerous public currency. The lawyer set a plan. She would contact detectives she trusted. We would quietly corroborate what we had with bank records and neighbour statements. We would let the system move when it was ready. Still, There was a part of me that wanted to be there when a light flicked on in the warehouse, and someone who had been slipping into an apartment at 2 a.m. looked up and met my eyes. That part of me was human, loud, and carried scar tissue. I didn't let it go. Instead, I sat in my car at the end of the block one night, listening to a playlist I didn't remember choosing, while Dante texted me updates about license plates and delivery schedules. I felt like a different kind of widow in that car, alert, small, and oddly sharpened. We organised quietly. Miss Hattie kept Malik for an evening. Her tiny apartment smelled of lavender and preserved lemon, while Dante and I checked the industrial park. The place looked like the sort of map you see in books about places no one watches carefully. Broken floodlights, a chain-link fence, the sputter of neon that hummed in a corner. We parked far enough away to blend in with the few other cars, the engine a steady companion. The rain made the metal roofs sing in a small, repetitive way. We weren't the only ones watching. From a dark corner of the lot came the thud of footsteps, and the shuffle you hear when someone moves with intent to stay unseen. Through the scope of Dante's borrowed binoculars, I watched a figure cross between stacked pallets toward a side door. He moved with the gait I'd seen on the footage, the slight favouring of a left leg. My hands trembled so hard I had to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Dante had a small recorder in his pocket. He'd been practicing keeping it ready for nights like this. We didn't plan to be heroes. We planned to be witnesses. We wanted to hear voices. We wanted something that, when handed to a lawyer, would not be just a shadow on a screen but a voice that could be tied to a person. When the door opened and the light from inside painted the pavement, a low, familiar voice floated out. It carried the kind of sarcasm Marcus had used when he wanted to cut corners and make it sound like a joke. It was the voice you recognise even when years have softened the edges. "You really thought I was gone," the voice said, sharp, not loud, a taunt that slid easily into the dark. Another voice answered, gruffer and younger, Darius's. "You told them what they needed to hear." We kept the recorder moving, held it like a small, precious thing. Inside the warehouse, the conversation drifted, fragments, mundane details, laughter like someone cleaning up a small victory. And then, the line I'd been waiting for, the one that narrowed the space between suspicion and certitude, an admission, not grandiose but cold and precise. "We collected. We split it," the voice said. They believed it. She kept sending it. The manner of the words felt like a pair of dull keys turning in a lock. I didn't move. I was under the car, probably a ridiculous, dangerous position, but I was there. The rain had slicked the asphalt into a silver mirror. The recorder carried the laugh that followed, and then a phrase I'll never forget. "Fool kept the ritual. Fool kept the cash." It was not explosive. It was a dirty, small thing, an accurate summation of what had been happening while I tried to pay honour with dollar bills. Dante and I left before anything else happened. We didn't approach. We didn't follow. We drove home like two people who had just been given oxygen. The recording lived on a file that we duplicated and stored in more than one place. I emailed it to the lawyer with a short note. "We have this. Please advise." The quickness of the response told me this was where contact with the police would begin. She called and said she would hand the file over to detectives she trusted, men and women who had experience with fraud and with cases that wore the disguise of family responsibility. The police arranged the operation with a quiet professionalism that felt like a different kind of mercy. Detectives came to my apartment and sat down at my kitchen table as if they were old acquaintances, then asked me the same questions 100 different ways: what I had seen, when, how the payments were made. They asked about witnesses, and I told them about Miss Hattie and Mrs. Jenkins and the printed clips tacked to my wall. They asked about the urn, and I gave them the video I had taken at the cemetery. They asked if I was willing to testify. I had never been in a room with men and women who'd seen the kinds of things I had described and then chosen to move. There was a steadiness in the way they spoke that made me think of hands building something solid from small parts. We filed formal complaints. We walked through the evidence. The detectives did their own corroborating, pulling records, tracing phone pings, confirming the industrial address had been used to register various shell names. The legal gears engaged the way a big machine does when you put a coin in, slowly, purposefully, with a mechanism that had sound and weight. The night of the raid, the city was the low, indifferent hum of late cars and streetlights. I sat in my living room with Malik folded up on the couch beside me, watching cartoons he barely noticed, studying the way the detective's texts flickered across my screen. Dante had promised to stay close by. Miss Hattie called to say she had dinner ready if anything happened. The lawyer texted, "Operation set. Stay put. Avoid contact." I thought about confrontation and felt a wash of complicated feelings: vindication, fear, sorrow. I thought of Viola and Elijah as people who had lived long enough to see the world darken in different ways. I thought that justice, if it was to be served, would not be quick. It would be legal, clumsy at times, but it would exist in the form of papers, testimony, and recorded sound. When the raid unfolded, I watched the live news crawl with a feeling that was almost surreal. The police moved in as teams, not as actors. The officers were efficient and careful. Reporters tried to get footage from across the barricades, voices overlapping like the rush of a river. I remember the small, ordinary detail that steadied me in the midst of it all. Malik reaching for my hand and tucking his small fingers into mine like we were practicing a new, braver ritual. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked in that drowsy way kids get when they're half astonished and half please explain. When the arrests were made, I heard later about the handcuffs and the silence and the way Marcus's shoulders hunched. I did not see him taken into custody. I do not want to make a spectacle of his capture. What I remember is the sense of the machine working, the detectives placing charger cables into devices, the lawyer writing notes, the officer who came to take a statement from me with the thoroughness of someone who understands the weight of truth. Marcus, Darius Buzzard, and 2 others were arrested that night at the warehouse. Charges were filed: fraud, conspiracy, possession of proceeds from false claims. The news called it a sting and described the recording that had followed the money trail. Viola and Elijah were questioned. The detectives determined that while they had benefited from the scheme in the sense that money had gone through their apartment, the picture of who knew what and when was more complex than initially assumed. In the end, the court ordered that the money be returned. They were held civilly responsible for restitution. The criminal focus of the prosecution was on those who had orchestrated the scheme, who had taken active steps to fabricate and sell the narrative of Marcus's death. The arraignment and trial following an arrest are like slow weather systems. You mark time by motions filed and discovery produced, by the way a case calendar fills up with dates. The months that followed were not flashy. They were a lot of waiting, of depositions, of defence motions and prosecutor responses. My phone became a repository for court dates. Dante took Malik to the park more times than I could count, and I learned to draw strength from the ordinary. That homework at the kitchen table, Malik's breath in the next room when he slept, the sound of the neighbour cat calling in the alley. Those things anchored me. At the trial, the prosecutor arranged the chain of evidence with the kind of clarity that makes a complicated thing readable. The camera frames tied to the timestamps in my ledger, my recorded urn video connecting the fabricated death to the claim, Dante's analysis showing patterns of visits tied to payments, and the warehouse recording where voices spoke plainly about collecting money. The defence tried, as defences do, to undermine plausibility, contesting identifications, questioning chain of custody, suggesting alternative explanations for the recordings. The judge listened, and the jury watched with the deliberate patience of people chosen to decide. Sitting in the courtroom was a strange way to be looking at the rest of your life. People in suits shuffled papers. The defendant's face had a kind of blankness that made me angry in a quiet way. I watched the counsel present exhibits, frames printed on paper, bank statements tagged and highlighted, the recording played in a way that the silence after it was almost louder than the sound. The audio file that had once lived on Dante's phone was now an exhibit in a room where small acts accumulated into legal truth. Evidence turned my private grief into a public object with weight. When the verdict came, guilty on counts of fraud and conspiracy, it landed like a weather front crossing a landscape. Not everything expected, but undeniable in its force. The judge sentenced Marcus to a term that reflected the court's view of intent. and Darius and the other accomplices received sentences proportional to their roles. The restitution order required the return of the money I had paid and a structure for repayment by those the court found liable. The parents were not criminally charged in the same way. The court's civil finding required them to return funds. The legal nuances are complex, but the outcome was clear in its essentials. The court recognized that a deception had been perpetrated and that the money I had paid under false premises needed to be returned. Relief arrived slowly. There was a practical satisfaction to seeing an order that named amounts and gave deadlines. But there was also a moral complexity to the process, the recognition that people's lives are entwined, that some acts are deliberate, and some are born of small failures to ask questions. Viola came to court for part of the proceedings, her shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed in a cloud. I did not revel in her discomfort. I felt a complicated mix of sorrow and resolution. Justice had not made everything clean. It had only created a public record that the lie had been a lie. The restitution process was, predictably, messy. Some of the funds were recovered through bank account freezes and negotiated settlements. Some were returned after the parents sold items and agreed to payments. The lawyer and the prosecutor worked together to make sure the financial part of the verdict had teeth. Over months I received payments in various forms, checks, transfers, a final settlement that felt like a closing note. It was not a fortune. It wasn't supposed to be. It was, concretely, money that represented years of caregiving and careful choices that had been misused. It allowed me to make different choices for Malik, without the constant question of whether we could cover next month. One of the first things I did with that money was to sell the apartment. The place that had been a refuge in a small prison, where the ritual of the envelope had been performed in secret for years, had to go. I sold it to a young couple who wanted to fix the bathroom and make it their own. Moving day was an odd ceremony. Friends packed boxes. Miss Hattie wheeled a plant down the stairs for me, like a blessing of small green things. I remember the way the city light caught the dust motes in the doorway as the movers carried the last box out. Ordinary, gritty, full of practical hope. I bought a condo with windows that opened onto a street with more sunlight than the old building had ever allowed. It is smaller in square footage, but larger in the thing that matters: air. Malik's room has a proper desk now, and a little lamp he insists on turning on to read even when the sun is out. We painted the walls with a colour he chose, a stubborn, bright blue he declared ocean. On quiet nights we sit by the window and watch the city lights blink like a promise we made to ourselves. There are things the legal system cannot fix. There are afternoons when the memory of ritual footsteps still surfaces, an old muscle memory that tightens whatever soft part of me remembers the past. There are moments when I see Viola across the street at the market, shuffling slowly with a cart, and I feel a tangle of pity and anger, two emotions that often sit side by side. But there is also a sense of empowerment that grows in the mundane. The way Malik laughs at something silly on television, and the way I no longer feel that ritual of slipping money through a slot, is the most loving thing I could do. The aftermath gave me space to think about boundaries. For a long time, my idea of love had been measured in quiet sacrifices. There is nobility in giving, yes. There is also a need for discernment. Giving when you are exploited is not love. It is a kind of loss that wears itself like clothing until you don't realize you're freezing. I learned to say no without shame and to insist on proof when the stakes are real. I learned that asking questions doesn't mean you are heartless. It means you are careful. Community held the thread that saved me. Miss Hattie's nudge to watch the camera, Mrs. Jenkins's small, corroborating details, Dante's hours at the laptop, the lawyer who did not condescend, the detectives who treated the case with the care it deserved. Each of them was a pattern in the web that became justice. I couldn't have done it alone, and the humility of that truth is part of the recovery. When people ask about forgiveness, I am honest. It is complicated. There are days I cannot imagine sitting across a table and sharing a cup of coffee with the people who profited from my grief. There are other days where I think forgiveness is less about absolving someone else and more about not letting that other person live rent-free in my head. I choose now to be pragmatic. I choose to teach Malik how to balance kindness with wisdom. I choose to protect his childhood from the kinds of shadows that once crowded our door. There were practical lessons too. Keep records. Insist on paper trails. When someone asks for cash and says it's easier, ask why. If something doesn't smell right, follow the scent with questions. There is a kind of bravery in asking a simple, inconvenient question. There is a kind of courage in saying, I can't do that, when your heart says otherwise. The rest of life reassembled itself in small, ordinary ways. Summer at the pool with Malik, a barbecue with Dante and his kids, an errand run that felt like a triumph because I no longer had to check my wallet and wonder whether I was letting something slide. I started volunteering at a local hotline for people who'd been through consumer fraud and family exploitation. It became a place where my story turned into a resource for someone else, where my mistakes and my learning could be practical lessons for people who needed a map. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the thinness of the line between honour and hurt. I remember telling myself that paying was the right thing, that I was preserving dignity and saving my family from scandal. I remember the way grief can make us quiet and susceptible, and how easy it is for others to fold that quiet into a profit. I do not regret wanting to honour Marcus. I regret the way that desire was manipulated. People often ask what I would do differently. Practically, I would start by insisting on documentation. Emotionally, I would reach out for help sooner. I would trust neighbours who notice patterns. I would not apologise for protecting my son. And finally, I would remind myself that loyalty is not the same as losing yourself. The final chapters of the legal story were not cinematic. There were hearings about restitution, forms to sign, bureaucratic patience to practice. Marcus served his sentence. Darius and the others served theirs. The court's order required the return of funds and a financial accounting that closed the loop on some of what had been taken. It did not erase the years I had spent paying, but it restored a measure of freedom. Financial, yes, but also psychological. The ability to walk down the street without thinking of every shadow. We rebuilt in the ordinary way people rebuild, small improvements and stubborn persistence. Malik finished 3rd grade with more confidence than he'd had a year earlier. He joined a little soccer team and came home one afternoon with a grin full of missing teeth. I found part-time work that allowed me to be home more often and did odd freelance gigs that let me save. We planted herbs on the condo balcony and learned how to make a decent basil pesto. Life became less about survival and more about choosing what to fill our minutes with. Sometimes people ask why I shared this story. Is it cathartic? Is it meant to shame? Mostly I tell them I tell it because someone handed me the possibility of justice, because Miss Hattie said a small, uncomfortable thing that mattered, because Dante kept a recorder and a steady hand, because a lawyer and detectives treated my evidence like the map it was, because the truth, when assembled in public, has the capacity to free not only money, but also the weight in a person's chest. If you are watching and something in this resonates, if you are the person who slides envelopes through a slot because someone asked you to, or if you are the person who ignores the quiet that says this isn't quite right, know this. Asking questions is not disloyal. Protecting your children, your future, and your peace is not tyrannical. There are places to turn: local legal aid, fraud hotlines, neighbourhood watch groups, and community counsellors who can help you document and make a plan. I won't pretend this all wrapped up neatly and erase the past. There are scars. There are nights I wake with the memory of an envelope in my hand. But the weight is lighter now. The ritual that ate my wages and my certainty is no longer in the foreground of our lives. Malik sleeps without the shadow of a ritual that cost us years. He is growing with a sense of safety he did not always have. If you've followed this far, thank you for listening to what was, for me, a long, slow unburdening. If this story helps even one person step back and look at the pattern in front of them, then telling it mattered. If you want to help someone you know who might be in a similar situation, share this video. In the description, you'll find links to resources, fraud prevention lines, legal aid organisations, and community groups that helped me. Please, if you have a story or a question, leave a comment. Community is how truth gets noticed. I kept my promise for years because I believed in keeping my word. I paid because grief made me hopeful that sacrifice could mend what death had left undone. Until I realised the truth, the camera, the stones, the recorded voice, that promise had become a chain around my life. Breaking it cost me time, worry, and sleeplessness. Rebuilding cost even more. But the truth set a course for justice. It didn't make the past disappear. It simply made a way forward possible, for me and for Malik. And that, in the end, is what I wanted more than anything. A safe, honest future for my son, and the quiet courage to protect it.